everyone, I'm Mike from Regala Photography, where we talk about everything photography. Have you noticed the changing landscape of photography videos on YouTube? They seem to switch from being educational and informative to nothing more than cheap entertainment. We'll be discussing how these videos became somewhat boring and repetitive. And we'll also touch on a prominent example, Mr. Peter McKinnon. In recent years, the popularity of photography-related content on platforms like YouTube has soared. From gear reviews to editing tutorials, creators like Peter McKinnon played a crucial role in educating and inspiring a new generation of photographers. The early days were marked by insightful tips, practical advice, and a genuine passion for the craft. Since many new YouTubers tend to copy or emulate the more popular YouTubers, you're seeing more and more photographers on YouTube producing similar content. However, it's hard to ignore the recent shift in the content landscape in regards of the photography niche. Many photography channels seem to prioritize entertainment over education. This is primarily due to creators having to make videos more for YouTube's algorithm and less about education. If creators really want to grow on YouTube, they need to provide videos that will captivate their audience as well as its algorithm. This shift, while attracting a broader audience, has left many aspiring photographers craving in-depth knowledge they once found in these videos. Creators either rehash the same old topics or switch completely to becoming entertainers like Gavin Hardcastle and Peter McKinnon. Now, don't get me wrong. I absolutely love watching these YouTubers. They have earned every bit of their success. But it seems that they have drifted from being a place for new photographers to learn their craft to someplace to being entertained and maybe picking up a tip or two about photography. Basically, they found a niche on YouTube that had a void to fill, which in turn provides them with the subscribers, likes, and views they need for making a living, which is understandable since they do get income from YouTube. All right, now let's talk about Peter McKinnon, who is a YouTuber who gained fame for his engaging and educational content. Initially, he was celebrated for his excellent teaching skills, breaking down complex concepts in a way that was easy to understand. However, some argue that he has transitioned more into the role of an entertainer than an educator. Watch some of Peter's videos from 3 or 4 years ago, and you'll see a completely different vibe. Just about all his videos were educational, with only a few entertaining style videos thrown in. Today, it seems to be just the opposite. Now, these videos are spectacular, to say the least. They are cinematic and have a high production value. It's obvious Peter has amazing skills, both as a photographer as well as a filmmaker. As a beginner photographer looking to learn new photography skills, are these videos. One common criticism is the repetition in many photography videos. Topics like 5 tips for better photos or the best camera settings have become staples, leaving viewers feeling like they've seen it all before. This repetition can be discouraging for those seeking fresh, insightful content to enhance their skills. I'm just as guilty at making videos like these. But with only having 261 subscribers at the recording of this video, I'm trying to build a larger audience. Of course, I would love to achieve the level of success that Peter McKinnon has had. And to be honest, I might be doing exactly what he is currently doing if I were in his place. Yes, that does make me a hypocrite. Now, it's crucial to note that entertainment has its place, and creators should be free to evolve their content. However, there is a delicate balance to strike between entertaining an audience and providing valuable educational content. It's not about abandoning one for the other, but finding harmony that serves both aspects. Plus, I feel YouTube themselves are guilty of hindering the creativity of creators by pushing their algorithm. Rene Ritchie, who was hired by YouTube to be the creator's ambassador and bridge the gap between the algorithm and creators, says that it's all about what the viewers want and not the algorithm. However, I feel as a viewer, I got better recommendations from YouTube before they made all these changes. The evolution of photography content on YouTube has been fascinating to witness. While the shift towards entertainment may have left some feeling unfulfilled, it's essential to remember that creators like Peter McKinnon are navigating their journey. Let's hope for a future where educational and entertaining content can coexist, providing a well-rounded experience for photography enthusiasts. Peter, if you're watching this, I really am a true fan of yours, and your videos help mold my skills as a photographer, as well as impacted my philosophy on photography. I hope that you don't take this video as criticism of you. It's actually a celebration of the impact you have not only on YouTube, but as a photographer in general. I truly believe you've earned every bit of your success. Thank you for all that you've taught me and for all the inspiration you provided me and others throughout my photography journey. If you enjoyed my video, please subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. It really does help. Ring that bell if you want to be notified when my next video is posted. Until next time, take care, everyone.